The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in room 204 of Jefferson High School, casting harsh shadows across the rows of empty desks. The afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, creating a dim atmosphere that seemed to match the tension filling the air. At the front of the classroom, Rebecca Hartwell sat behind her mahogany desk, her steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to mirror the rigid set of her jaw. Her pale fingers drummed impatiently against a stack of papers as she waited. 17-year-old Simone Johnson pushed open the heavy wooden door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She moved with quiet confidence, her dark eyes alert and intelligent despite the exhaustion that shadowed her features. Her natural hair was styled in neat braids that fell past her shoulders, and she wore a simple navy cardigan over dark jeans. There was something in her posture that spoke of determination, a steel spine that refused to bend even under pressure. "You wanted to see me, Mrs. Hartwell?" Simone's voice was respectful but guarded. She had learned to read the warning signs in her teacher's expressions, and today the older woman's face was a mask of cold disapproval. Rebecca looked up slowly, her thin lips pressed into a line that could barely be called a smile. She held up a paper, letting it dangle between her fingers like a piece of evidence. "Your essay on the civil rights movement. We need to discuss it." Simone felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. She had poured hours into that assignment, researching beyond the required sources, crafting arguments that connected historical struggles to contemporary issues. It was some of her best work, and she knew it. "What about it?" "Sit down, Miss Johnson." Rebecca's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She waited until Simone had settled into the front row seat before continuing. "This essay is unacceptable." The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Simone blinked, her hands instinctively gripping the edges of her desk. "I don't understand. I followed the assignment guidelines exactly. I cited all my sources. "The content is the problem," Rebecca interrupted, her voice cutting through Simone's protest like a blade. "This isn't history, Miss Johnson. This is propaganda. This is political activism masquerading as academic work." Simone's breathing became shallow, but she forced herself to remain calm. The assignment was to analyze the impact of civil rights protests on American society. That's exactly what I did. I examined peaceful demonstrations, their effectiveness, and their lasting influence on social change. Rebecca leaned forward, her pale eyes narrowing. "What you did was write a manifesto encouraging student protests and civil disobedience. You connected historical events to current issues that have no place in my classroom. This school is not a platform for your political agenda." "My political agenda?" Simone's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion she was trying so hard to contain. "I wrote about history, about real events that actually happened, about people who fought for basic human rights." "And you concluded by suggesting that modern students should follow their example," Rebecca snapped, lifting the paper and reading from it in a mocking tone. Quote, "The courage of those who came before us reminds us that when faced with injustice, silence is complicity. Students today must find their own ways to stand up for what is right, to use their voices for positive change." Unquote. She set the paper down with deliberate force. "That is not historical analysis, Miss Johnson. That is incitement." Simone stared at her teacher, disbelief washing over her like cold water. Those words had been carefully chosen, reflecting hours of thought about how past struggles connected to present challenges. "That's a conclusion based on historical evidence. I supported every argument with documented facts and credible sources. Just because you disagree with the implications doesn't make it wrong." "I don't disagree with implications, Miss Johnson. I disagree with students who think they know better than their teachers, who believe they can use my classroom to promote disruption and disorder." Rebecca's voice grew colder with each word. "You've been involved in various protests around the school, haven't you? The walkout over funding cuts, the demonstration about dress code policies, the petition about cafeteria conditions. Simone lifted her chin, meeting her teacher's gaze directly. Those were peaceful expressions of student concerns about legitimate issues. We have the right to... You have the right to learn what I teach you. Rebecca cut her off. Nothing more. And what you've written here shows me that you're more interested in causing trouble than in learning American history. I am learning American history. I'm learning about the people who refused to accept injustice, who stood up for their beliefs even when it was dangerous. People like Ida B. Wells, who investigated lynchings when no one else would. Like Fannie Lou Hamer, who fought for voting rights despite facing violence and intimidation. Like the students who integrated Little Rock Central High School, knowing they would face hatred and hostility. Simone's voice grew stronger with each name she mentioned, drawing strength from the legacy of courage she had studied. Rebecca's expression hardened further. Those are not the examples you should be following, Miss Johnson. Those people lived in a different time, faced different circumstances. Your situation today is not comparable to the struggles of the past. You attend a fully integrated school, you have equal opportunities, you face no systemic barriers to your education or success, yet you seem determined to see oppression where none exists. The words hit Simone like physical blows. She thought about the subtle ways she was treated differently, the lowered expectations, the assumption that her achievements were somehow less earned than those of her white classmates. She thought about the school-to-prison pipeline that funneled students who looked like her into disciplinary systems while others received second chances. She thought about the history curriculum that glossed over uncomfortable truths and presented a sanitized version of American progress. Mrs. Hartwell, Simone said quietly, respectfully, I don't think you understand what I experience as a black student in this school. The examples I cited are still relevant because the fight for equality isn't over. It looks different now, but it's not over. Rebecca stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her face flushed with anger, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with barely controlled fury. How dare you? How dare you sit in my classroom and accuse me of not understanding equality? I have been teaching for 25 years, Miss Johnson. I have taught students of every background, every color, every economic situation. I have never, not once, treated any student differently because of their race. Simone remained seated, but her hands were shaking now. She clasped them together in her lap, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. I'm not accusing you of intentional discrimination, Mrs. Hartwell, but the fact remains that when I write about historical protests and their relevance to today's issues, you call it propaganda. When I draw connections between past struggles and present challenges, you call it activism. Would you respond the same way if I were white? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to indignation to something that might have been uncertainty. Then her features hardened again, settling into cold resolve. Your race has nothing to do with this, Miss Johnson. Your attitude does. Your grade on this assignment is an F. She picked up a red pen and wrote the letter at the top of Simone's paper with sharp, angry strokes. And if you continue to use my classroom as a platform for your political views, you'll find that this F is just the beginning. Simone felt the world tilt around her. An F would devastate her grade point average, potentially affecting her college applications and scholarship opportunities. She had worked too hard, come too far to let it end like this. Mrs. Hartwell, please, can I rewrite it? Can we discuss? The discussion is over, Rebecca said, holding out the paper. Take your essay and think about what you've learned today. Think about whether your pride is worth jeopardizing your academic future. Simone stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She reached for the paper, her fingers brushing against her teacher's cold ones for just a moment. The red F seemed to burn against the white paper, a scarlet letter marking her as defiant, rebellious, trouble. She looked at Mrs. Hartwell one more time, seeing something in the older woman's eyes that she couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or guilt, or simply the determination of someone who had decided that control mattered more than justice. "I have learned something today," Simone said quietly. "I've learned that some people would rather silence uncomfortable truths than confront them. But I've also learned that I'm not going to let that silence me." She turned and walked toward the door, her spine straight despite the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her she heard Rebecca's voice, sharp and warning. "Miss Johnson, I would be very careful about your next steps." Very careful indeed. Simone paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She didn't turn around when she spoke. "So would I, Mrs. Hartwell. So would I." The hallway outside was empty, most students having left for the day. Simone walked slowly toward her locker, the essay clutched in her hand like evidence of a crime. Her reflection caught in the glass display case filled with trophies and awards, and she barely recognized the girl staring back at her. There was something different in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there an hour ago. She thought about her parents who had sacrificed so much to give her opportunities they never had. She thought about her younger brother who looked up to her as an example. She thought about all the students who would come after her, who might face the same choice between speaking their truth and keeping their heads down. The F on her paper felt like more than a grade. It felt like a test, a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. On one side lay safety, acceptance, the path of least resistance. On the other lay risk, uncertainty, the possibility of standing up for something bigger than herself. Simone folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her backpack. She had a decision to make, and she already knew what it would be. The only question now was how far she was willing to go to make her voice heard. As she walked out of the building into the fading afternoon light, she could almost hear the voices of those who had come before her, the ones she had written about in her essay. They seemed to whisper in the wind, reminding her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting in spite of it. The battle lines had been drawn, and Simone Johnson was ready to fight. 3 months earlier, the first day of senior year had dawned bright with possibility for Simone Johnson. She had walked through the doors of Jefferson High School with her head held high, her academic record spotless, her future stretching ahead like an open road. The daughter of 2 hard-working parents who had never attended college themselves, she carried their dreams along with her own ambitions. Her mother, Denise Johnson, worked double shifts as a nurse at the county hospital, her hands always smelling of antiseptic and her scrubs bearing the weight of other people's pain. Her father, Calvin Johnson, drove a delivery truck for a local furniture company, his back aching from years of lifting heavy loads, his paycheck stretched thin across mortgage payments and grocery bills. They had both made it clear from the time Simone could talk that education was her ticket to something better, something more. "You're going to be the first Johnson to walk across a college graduation stage," her mother would say, smoothing Simone's hair as she helped with homework at the kitchen table. "And you're going to walk with your head high, knowing you earned every step." Simone had taken those words to heart, earning straight A's throughout elementary and middle school, joining the debate team in 9th grade, volunteering at the local community center on weekends. She had mapped out her senior year with military precision, maintain her 4.0 GPA, win the state debate championship, secure early admission to one of her top choice universities with a full scholarship. Everything had been going according to plan until she met Rebecca Hartwell. American history was supposed to be a straightforward class, a requirement she could handle easily while focusing her energy on more challenging AP courses. Simone had always loved history, fascinated by the stories of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. She devoured biographies of civil rights leaders, watched documentaries about social movements, read everything she could find about the complex, often painful journey toward equality in America. But from the first day of class, something had felt off. Mrs. Hartwell's version of American history was sanitized, simplified, stripped of the moral complexity that made it compelling. The textbook she assigned was 30 years old, its pages yellowed with age, its perspective limited to the experiences of white Americans. When the curriculum touched on slavery, it was presented as an unfortunate economic system that had been peacefully resolved through political compromise. The civil rights movement was condensed into a feel-good narrative about Dr. King's dream and Rosa Parks' tired feet. Simone had tried to ask questions, to dig deeper into the topics that interested her. She raised her hand to discuss the economic factors that had perpetuated racial inequality after slavery ended. She attempted to explore the role of white supremacist organizations in resisting civil rights progress. She wanted to examine the ways that systemic racism had evolved and adapted over time, maintaining its influence through different methods. Each time, Mrs. Hartwell had shut her down with polite but firm dismissals. "We need to stick to the curriculum, Miss Johnson. That's outside the scope of this course. Let's focus on the material that will be on the test." The message was clear: stay in your lane, don't rock the boat. Learn what you're taught and nothing more. But Simone couldn't turn off her curiosity, couldn't stop herself from seeing connections between past and present, couldn't ignore the gap between the history she was learning in class and the reality she experienced in her daily life. The tension had started small, manifesting in subtle ways. When Simone wrote thoughtful responses to essay questions, Mrs. Hartwell would praise her research skills while questioning her conclusions. When she participated in class discussions, her contributions were acknowledged briefly before the conversation moved on to other topics. When she suggested alternative perspectives or additional sources, she was thanked for her enthusiasm but reminded that the class had limited time to cover required material. It might have continued that way, a quiet friction that never quite erupted into open conflict, if not for the events that began unfolding around the school in late September. Budget cuts had eliminated the arts program, leaving students without access to music, theater, or visual arts classes. The dress code had been revised to include provisions that seemed to target female students and students of color. The cafeteria had switched to a cheaper food service company, resulting in meals that were barely edible and nutritionally questionable. One by one, these issues had sparked student organizing efforts. Simone found herself at the center of several peaceful protests, not because she sought attention or conflict, but because she couldn't stand by while problems that affected her fellow students went unaddressed. She helped organize a walkout to protest the arts program cuts, gathering signatures on petitions and speaking at school board meetings. She joined a student committee that challenged the new dress code policies, arguing that they were discriminatory and unclear. She worked with the student government to address the cafeteria situation, researching nutrition standards and comparing costs with other districts. Each action had been legal, peaceful, and conducted through proper channels. The students had followed school policies for organizing activities, obtained necessary permissions, and worked within the system to address their concerns. Some of their efforts had even been successful, resulting in minor policy changes and increased communication between administration and students. But Mrs. Hartwell had watched these activities with growing disapproval. She made comments in class about students who were more interested in causing trouble than learning. She assigned extra reading to students who missed class for protest activities, even when those absences were officially excused. She began calling on Simone less frequently during discussions, and when she did, her questions had an edge to them, a hint of challenge that hadn't been there before. Other teachers had responded differently to student activism. Mr. Rodriguez, who taught AP Government, used current events and student organizing efforts as teaching tools, helping his students understand how democratic processes worked in practice. Ms. Chen, the English teacher, encouraged students to write about issues they cared about, helping them develop their voices and argumentation skills. Coach Davis, who led the debate team, saw student activism as excellent preparation for competitive debate since it taught research skills and the ability to construct persuasive arguments. But Mrs. Hartwell seemed to view student engagement as a threat to classroom order and her own authority. The more involved Simone became in addressing school issues, the more distant and critical her history teacher became. It was as if every act of student leadership, every moment of standing up for herself and her peers, was being recorded as evidence against her character. The breaking point had come with the essay assignment on the civil rights movement. Mrs. Hartwell had distributed the assignment with her usual emphasis on following directions and sticking to approved sources. Students were to write a 5-page analysis of civil rights protests in the 1960s, examining their methods, goals, and outcomes. For Simone, the assignment had felt like an opportunity to bridge the gap between classroom learning and real-world application. She had researched extensively, using not just the provided textbook but also primary sources, academic journals, and contemporary accounts of the period. She had interviewed her grandfather, who had participated in sit-ins as a college student, and her great-aunt, who had been part of voter registration drives in the rural South. Her essay had examined the strategic thinking behind different forms of protest, analyzing how activists had chosen methods that would maximize impact while minimizing harm. She had discussed the role of young people in the movement, highlighting the courage of students who had risked their educational opportunities to fight for broader social change. She had connected historical strategies to contemporary movements, suggesting that modern students could learn from the examples of those who had come before them. It was thoughtful, well-researched, and carefully argued. She had stayed up until 3 in the morning for several nights, polishing every paragraph, checking every citation, ensuring that her analysis was both thorough and nuanced. When she finally submitted it, she had felt proud of the work she had done. She should have known that pride would be short-lived. She should have recognized the warning signs in Mrs. Hartwell's increasingly cold demeanor. She should have understood that in some people's minds, a black student writing about resistance to oppression would always be seen as dangerous, regardless of the academic context. But she had believed, with the optimism of someone who had always found that hard work and good intentions were rewarded, that excellence would speak for itself. She had trusted that her teacher would evaluate her work based on its merits, not on her fears about what it might represent. That trust had been shattered in room 204, under fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh relief. The F on her paper was more than a grade. It was a message, a warning, a line drawn in red ink across her academic future. As Simone walked home that afternoon, her backpack heavy with the weight of disappointment, she thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment. She could have stayed quiet in class, accepting the simplified version of history she was taught. She could have avoided student activism, focusing solely on her individual academic success. She could have written a different essay, one that said what her teacher wanted to hear rather than what she believed to be true. But even as she considered these alternatives, she knew she wouldn't have chosen differently. The voices of those who had come before her seemed to whisper in the autumn wind, reminding her that progress had never come from silence, that justice had never been achieved by those who were willing to accept injustice for the sake of personal comfort. The F was devastating, but it was also clarifying. It forced her to confront a question she had been avoiding. What was she willing to sacrifice to make her voice heard? What price was she prepared to pay for standing up for her beliefs? As she turned the corner onto her street, she could see her house in the distance, its modest frame structure a symbol of everything her family had worked to achieve. Inside, her parents would be waiting to hear about her day, proud of their daughter who was going to be the first in their family to attend college. She would have to tell them about the F. She would have to explain why her teacher had punished her for writing about civil rights, why her academic future was now in jeopardy because she had dared to connect historical struggles to contemporary challenges. But she would also have to tell them about the choice she was facing, the decision she had already begun to make. She could apologize, rewrite the essay to satisfy Mrs. Hartwell's demands, and move on with her senior year according to the plan she had so carefully constructed. Or she could fight. She could challenge the grade, appeal to higher authorities, make her case in public if necessary. She could risk everything she had worked for in order to defend not just her own rights, but the rights of every student who came after her. It wasn't really a choice at all. The moment Mrs. Hartwell had dismissed her voice, had labeled her thoughtful analysis as propaganda, had tried to silence her with threats and intimidation, the die had been cast. Simone Johnson was going to fight, and she was going to win. The kitchen table had seen better days, its surface scarred by years of homework sessions, family meals, and late-night conversations that shaped the Johnson family's understanding of the world. Tonight, it bore the weight of Simone's essay, the red F glowing like a wound under the warm light of the overhead fixture. Denise Johnson sat across from her daughter, her nurse's uniform traded for comfortable pajamas, her dark eyes scanning the pages with growing disbelief. Calvin Johnson paced behind his wife, his work boots replaced by slippers that whispered against the linoleum floor. "Read that conclusion again," Calvin said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The part she said was propaganda." Denise cleared her throat and read aloud. "The courage of those who came before us reminds us that when faced with injustice, silence is complicity. Students today must find their own ways to stand up for what is right, to use their voices for positive change." She looked up at her daughter, who sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Baby, this is beautiful. This is exactly the kind of thinking we raised you to do." "That's what I told Mrs. Hartwell," Simone said quietly. "I tried to explain that I was drawing connections between historical events and contemporary issues. That's what analysis is supposed to do, right? Make meaning from the facts." Calvin stopped pacing and placed his hands on his wife's shoulders. "This isn't about your analysis, sweetheart. This is about a teacher who doesn't want to hear certain truths from certain students. This is about fear." "Fear of what?" Simone asked, though she already knew the answer. "Fear of a young black woman who thinks too much, reads too much, questions too much," Denise said softly. "Fear of someone who won't stay in the box they've built for you." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that truth settling over them like a heavy blanket. This wasn't Simone's first encounter with teachers who seemed uncomfortable with her academic intensity or her willingness to speak up in class. But it was the first time her grades had been affected, the first time her academic future had been threatened for the crime of thinking critically. "So what do we do?" Calvin asked, though his tone suggested he already had ideas. Simone took a deep breath. She had been thinking about this question since she left Mrs. Hartwell's classroom, turning over possibilities and considering consequences. "I want to appeal the grade. I want to take this to the administration and show them that she failed me for expressing legitimate academic viewpoints." Denise nodded slowly. "That's your right, baby. But you know it won't be easy. Teachers have a lot of authority when it comes to grading, especially subjective assignments like essays. You'll need to prove that she acted unfairly." "I can prove it," Simone said, her voice gaining strength. "I followed every requirement of the assignment. My essay is well-researched, properly cited, and addresses all the topics she asked us to cover. The only thing she objected to was my conclusion that connected historical protest strategies to modern student activism. That's not propaganda, that's analytical thinking." Calvin pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, his expression serious. "Simone, I want you to understand what you're taking on here. This isn't just about one grade. If you challenge this teacher, you're challenging a system, and systems don't like to be challenged, especially by people who look like us." "I know, Daddy. But what's the alternative? Accept the F and let her silence me? Let her think she can intimidate any student who dares to think differently?" Simone's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. I've worked too hard to let someone else's fear destroy my future." Denise reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Your father and I will support you no matter what you decide. But if you're going to fight this, you need to be smart about it. You need allies, evidence, a strategy that goes beyond just being right." "Coach Davis," Simone said immediately. "She'll support me. She's always encouraged us to take strong positions and defend them with evidence. That's exactly what I did in this essay." Camille Davis had been coaching the debate team for 8 years, turning Jefferson High's program into one of the most competitive in the state. She was a young black woman herself, only 29 years old, who understood the particular challenges her students faced when they dared to excel in intellectual pursuits. More than once, she had gone to bat for team members who were being held to different standards by other teachers. "That's a good start," Calvin said. "But you'll need more than one teacher on your side. You'll need documentation, witnesses, maybe even community support if this thing gets bigger." Simone nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. "There are other students in my class who heard her reaction to my essay, and I'm not the only one she's been harder on since the protests started. Isaiah Clark was in that walkout with me, and she's been giving him a hard time ever since." Isaiah was a junior who had emerged as one of the more vocal student activists at Jefferson High. He was smart, articulate, and unafraid to ask challenging questions in class. He had also noticed Mrs. Hartwell's increasing hostility toward students who participated in organizing activities. "You need to talk to him," Denise said. "Find out if he's experienced the same kind of treatment. If there's a pattern of behavior, that strengthens your case." The conversation continued late into the night, with the Johnson family mapping out a strategy that would give Simone the best chance of success. They discussed the chain of command at the school, researching the policies and procedures for grade appeals. They talked about documentation, identifying the evidence Simone would need to support her claims. They considered the potential consequences, both positive and negative, of challenging Mrs. Hartwell's authority. By the time they finally said goodnight, Simone felt more determined than ever. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had ever been punished for thinking too deeply, for questioning too much, for refusing to accept simplified answers to complex questions. The next morning, Simone arrived at school early, her backpack filled with copies of her essay and notes from her conversation with her parents. She found Coach Davis in the debate team's practice room, preparing for first period. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with research materials, its walls covered with certificates and photographs from past competitions. Camille Davis looked up as Simone entered, immediately noticing something different in her star debater's demeanor. "You look like someone who's been up all night making battle plans," she said with a slight smile. "What's going on?" Simone closed the door behind her and pulled out her essay. "I need your help, Coach. And I think I need it more than I've ever needed anything before." She explained the situation, walking Coach Davis through the assignment, her research process, and Mrs. Hartwell's reaction. As she spoke, she watched her coach's expression shift from curiosity to concern to barely controlled anger. "Let me see the essay," Coach Davis said when Simone finished. She read it carefully, her lips moving silently as she processed each argument and transition. When she reached the conclusion, she read it twice before looking up. "Simone, this is excellent work. Your argumentation is sound, your research is thorough, and your writing is clear and compelling. More than that, this is exactly the kind of critical thinking we've been working on in debate. You've taken historical evidence and used it to construct a logical argument about contemporary issues." "That's what I thought," Simone said, relief flooding through her. "But Mrs. Hartwell called it propaganda. She said I was using her classroom to promote my political agenda." Coach Davis set the essay down and leaned back in her chair. "Simone, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to you yesterday wasn't about academics. It wasn't about the quality of your work or your adherence to assignment guidelines. It was about a teacher who felt threatened by your intelligence and your willingness to speak truth to power. The words hung in the air between them, giving name to something Simone had felt but hadn't quite been able to articulate. So, what do I do about it? You fight, Coach Davis said without hesitation. But you fight smart. You document everything. You build a coalition of support, and you make sure that when you take your case to the administration, you have evidence they can't ignore. Over the next hour, they developed a strategy. Coach Davis would review the essay and provide a written evaluation of its academic merit, offering her professional opinion as an experienced educator. Simone would gather statements from classmates who had witnessed Mrs. Hartwell's behavior. They would research the school's policies on grading and academic freedom, identifying the specific standards that had been violated. There's something else you should consider, Coach Davis said as they wrapped up their planning session. The state debate championship is in 3 months. You're our best shot at winning it all. If you pursue this complaint against Mrs. Hartwell, it might create distractions or complications that could affect your preparation. Simone had been thinking about the same thing. The debate championship was the culmination of 4 years of hard work, the achievement that would set her apart from other college applicants. Winning it would guarantee her recognition and scholarship opportunities that could change her entire future. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the choice was an illusion. Coach, if I don't fight this, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had stood up for myself. And more than that, I'll be letting down every student who comes after me. Mrs. Hartwell is going to keep doing this to other kids unless someone stops her. Coach Davis smiled, pride evident in her expression. That's the competitor I know. That's the debater who's going to bring home the state championship. You think I can do both, challenge the grade and win the championship? I think you're going to do both because they're not separate things, Simone. They're the same fight. Standing up for your principles, defending your ideas with evidence, refusing to be intimidated by authority figures, that's what great debaters do. This situation with Mrs. Hartwell is just practice for the real thing. As first period approached, Simone felt a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced since receiving that devastating F. She had a plan, she had support, and she had the knowledge that she was fighting not just for herself, but for something larger and more important. The battle with Mrs. Hartwell was just beginning, but Simone Johnson was ready. She had been preparing for this fight her entire life, even if she hadn't known it. Every book she had read, every question she had asked, every time she had refused to accept incomplete answers had been leading to this moment. She was going to challenge the grade, and she was going to win. But more than that, she was going to prove that students like her students, who thought critically, who questioned authority, who refused to be silenced, deserved to have their voices heard. The championship was still 3 months away, but the real competition had already begun. Principal Lawrence Washington had been leading Jefferson High School for 6 years, long enough to recognize the difference between routine administrative complaints and situations that required careful attention. The email from Simone Johnson that appeared in his inbox on a Tuesday morning fell firmly into the latter category. As he read her formal request to appeal her grade in American history, his weathered hands drummed against his desk blotter with increasing concern. Lawrence was a man who understood the delicate balance required to lead a diverse school community. At 52, he had spent his entire career in public education, working his way up from classroom teacher to department chair to assistant principal, before finally earning the top job at Jefferson High. He was one of only 3 black principals in the district, a fact that came with both opportunity and responsibility that he never took lightly. The Johnson girls' case wasn't his first encounter with Mrs. Hartwell's rigid teaching style, but it was the most serious complaint he had received. As he read Simone's carefully written appeal, he found himself impressed by her articulate presentation of the facts, and her clear understanding of school policy. This wasn't the work of an angry teenager lashing out at a bad grade. This was the methodical approach of someone who had done her homework. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Linda, I need you to pull the file on Mrs. Hartwell. Teaching evaluations, any previous complaints, the whole thing, and schedule a meeting with her for this afternoon. Tell her it's regarding a grade appeal." The file that landed on his desk an hour later made for uncomfortable reading. Rebecca Hartwell had been teaching at Jefferson High for 12 years, with generally positive evaluations and few parent complaints. But there was a pattern buried in the paperwork that became more obvious the closer he looked. 3 informal complaints in the past 2 years, all from parents of Black or Hispanic students who felt their children were being treated unfairly. 2 requests for transfers out of her class in the previous semester, both from students of color who cited feeling unwelcome in classroom discussions. None of the complaints had resulted in formal disciplinary action, partly because they were difficult to substantiate and partly because Mrs. Hartwell was careful about how she expressed her biases. She never used explicitly racist language or made overtly discriminatory statements. Instead, she employed more subtle methods, dismissing certain perspectives as inappropriate, showing less patience with questions from minority students, and interpreting passionate engagement with material as disruptive behavior. Lawrence closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at students moving between buildings during the lunch break. He thought about his own daughter, a sophomore at a school across town, and how he would feel if she faced the kind of treatment Simone was describing. The thought made his stomach clench with protective anger. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Mrs. Hartwell entered his office with the bearing of someone who expected to be vindicated. She was dressed professionally in a navy suit, her gray hair perfectly styled, her expression one of patient martyrdom. She took the seat across from his desk without being invited, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "Lawrence, I understand you wanted to see me about some sort of grade appeal. I hope you know that in all my years of teaching, I've never had my professional judgment questioned in this manner." Her tone suggested that the very idea was both insulting and unprecedented. "Rebecca, thank you for coming in." Lawrence kept his voice neutral, professional. "I've received a formal appeal regarding a grade you assigned to Simone Johnson. She's claiming that you failed her essay for reasons unrelated to its academic merit." Mrs. Hartwell's expression hardened slightly. "Simone Johnson is a bright girl, but she has some serious attitude problems. She's been involved in various disruptive activities around the school, and lately she's been bringing that same disruptive energy into my classroom." "Can you be more specific about what you mean by disruptive?" "She questions everything I teach. She argues with the curriculum. She tries to turn every discussion into a platform for her political views." Mrs. Hartwell shifted in her seat, her composure showing the first signs of strain. The essay she submitted was supposed to be about the civil rights movement, but instead she wrote what amounted to a manifesto encouraging student protests. Lawrence picked up a copy of Simone's essay from his desk. He had read it twice since receiving her appeal, and while he could understand how someone might find its conclusions challenging, he struggled to see how it merited a failing grade. "I've reviewed the essay, Rebecca. It appears to meet all the stated requirements of the assignment. Can you walk me through your specific concerns?" "The content is inappropriate," she said flatly. "Students today seem to think they can use any assignment as an excuse to promote their personal agendas. This essay wasn't academic analysis, it was activism. The conclusion draws connections between historical protest strategies and contemporary student activism. Isn't that exactly what we want students to do? Make connections between past and present?" Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed slightly. "There's a difference between academic analysis and encouraging rebellion, Lawrence. This girl has been nothing but trouble since the beginning of the school year. She organized walkouts, she challenges dress code policies, she questions cafeteria procedures. Now she's trying to use my classroom to validate those activities. Lawrence set the essay down and leaned forward. Rebecca, help me understand something. Are you saying that Simone's grade was influenced by her participation in legitimate student activities outside your classroom? I'm saying that her attitude in my classroom reflects her general disrespect for authority and school policies. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was rising slightly, her professional demeanor slipping. She doesn't want to learn history, Lawrence. She wants to rewrite it to fit her worldview. And what worldview is that exactly? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mrs. Hartwell seemed to realize she was approaching dangerous territory, and she took a moment to compose herself before responding. She sees racism and oppression everywhere, even where it doesn't exist. She can't accept that things are different now than they were in the past. She wants to find parallels between the 1960s and today that simply aren't there. Lawrence nodded slowly, making notes on a pad in front of him. I see. And in your professional opinion as a history teacher, there are no relevant connections between civil rights strategies of the past and contemporary social movements? Of course there are some connections, Mrs. Hartwell said, clearly frustrated by the direction of the conversation. But students need to understand that we live in a post-racial society. The battles of the civil rights movement were won. Students today don't face the same challenges, and pretending they do is both inaccurate and inflammatory. There it was, Lawrence thought. The fundamental disagreement that had led to this confrontation. Mrs. Hartwell genuinely believed that racism had been resolved through the legislative victories of the 1960s, and she viewed any suggestion to the contrary as troublemaking rather than legitimate analysis. Rebecca, I want you to take a few days to reconsider this grade. Review the assignment requirements, look at the essay again with fresh eyes, and see if you think an F is really warranted for this work. Mrs. Hartwell straightened in her chair, her expression becoming defensive. Lawrence, I've been teaching for 25 years. I know how to evaluate student work. That essay deserved the grade I gave it, and I'm not going to change it just because a student complains. I'm not asking you to change it because a student complained. I'm asking you to reconsider it because I think you may have let factors other than academic merit influence your evaluation. Lawrence's tone remained professional, but there was steel underneath it now. Take the time, Rebecca. Really think about it. After Mrs. Hartwell left his office, Lawrence spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing school policies on grading disputes and academic freedom. The district had clear guidelines about the factors that could legitimately influence grades, and political viewpoints expressed in academic work were explicitly protected as long as they were relevant to the assignment and properly supported. He also made several phone calls, gathering more information about the situation. Coach Davis provided a glowing assessment of Simone's analytical abilities and confirmed that the essay demonstrated exactly the kind of critical thinking skills the school claimed to value. Two other teachers who had worked with Simone spoke highly of her academic performance and her respectful behavior in their classrooms. But it was his conversation with Isaiah Clark that proved most illuminating. The junior confirmed that Mrs. Hartwell had indeed become more hostile toward students who participated in protest activities, and he provided specific examples of her behavior that painted a troubling picture. She made a comment last week about students who think they know better than their teachers, Isaiah reported. She was looking right at me and Simone when she said it, and yesterday, when I asked a question about the economic factors that contributed to the civil rights movement, she shut me down and said we needed to focus on the material that would be on the test. Lawrence thanked Isaiah for his honesty and assured him that his willingness to come forward would not result in any retaliation. But as he hung up the phone, he felt the weight of the decision that was coming. This wasn't just about one essay or one grade anymore. It was about creating an environment where students felt safe to express their ideas and engage with challenging material. That evening, Lawrence called Simone at home. I wanted to let you know that I've begun a formal review of your grade appeal. I've spoken with Mrs. Hartwell, reviewed your essay, and gathered additional information about the situation. Thank you, Mr. Washington, Simone said, her voice carefully controlled. Can you tell me what happens next? I'm going to make a decision within the next few days, but I want you to know that regardless of the outcome, I'm impressed by how you've handled this situation. You've followed proper procedures, documented your concerns, and conducted yourself professionally throughout this process. I just want to be treated fairly, Simone said quietly. I want my work to be judged on its merits, not on Mrs. Hartwell's opinion of my activities outside her classroom. That's exactly what should happen, Lawrence assured her. And if it hasn't been happening, we're going to fix it. After ending the call, Lawrence sat in his home office, staring at the stack of papers spread across his desk. Simone's essay, Mrs. Hartwell's personnel file, the school's academic freedom policies, statements from other teachers and students, all the evidence he needed to make a decision that would affect not just these two individuals but the entire school community. He thought about the conversation he would need to have with Mrs. Hartwell, about the message this case would send to other teachers and students, about the precedent he was setting for how the school would handle similar situations in the future. But mostly, he thought about Simone Johnson, a 17-year-old girl who had risked her academic standing to defend her right to think critically and speak her mind. Students like her were the reason he had become an educator in the first place, and he wasn't about to let anyone silence her voice. The decision, he realized, had already been made. Now all that remained was acting on it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Principal Washington's office as he prepared for what would likely be one of the most significant meetings of his administrative career. The papers spread across his desk told a story that had become all too familiar in American schools. A talented student of color challenging an educational system that preferred compliance over critical thinking. Lawrence had spent the previous evening reviewing every piece of evidence one final time. Simone's essay, which demonstrated sophisticated analysis and careful research. Mrs. Hartwell's personnel file with its pattern of complaints from minority students and parents, the school district's policies on academic freedom and fair grading practices, the testimonials from other educators who had worked with Simone and could attest to her character and capabilities. The evidence was clear, but the implications of his decision would ripple far beyond this single case. Lawrence understood that he wasn't just ruling on a grade dispute. He was making a statement about what Jefferson High School stood for and what kind of learning environment it would provide for all students. His secretary's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Washington, Mrs. Hartwell is here for her appointment. Send her in, please. Rebecca Hartwell entered the office with the same composed demeanor she had displayed 2 days earlier, but Lawrence could see the tension in her shoulders and the tight line of her mouth. She had clearly spent time preparing for this meeting, bringing a folder of materials and wearing her most professional attire. Good morning, Rebecca. Thank you for coming in early. Please, have a seat. She settled into the chair across from his desk, placing her folder on her lap and folding her hands over it. I assume you've made a decision about Miss Johnson's grade appeal? I have, Lawrence said, his tone measured but firm. But before I share that decision, I want to give you one more opportunity to reconsider your evaluation of her essay. Have you had a chance to review it again as I suggested? Mrs. Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I have reviewed it, Lawrence, and my assessment remains unchanged. The essay violated the boundaries of appropriate academic discourse by encouraging student activism and challenging school authority. The grade was justified. Lawrence nodded slowly, making a note on the pad in front of him. I see. And you maintain that this evaluation was based solely on the academic content of the essay, with no consideration of Miss Johnson's activities outside your classroom? Of course, she replied, though her voice carried a hint of defensiveness. I evaluate all my students based on their work, nothing else. Lawrence opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder. Rebecca, I want you to understand that this conversation is being recorded for documentation purposes. The district requires that all formal disciplinary meetings be properly documented. For the first time, Mrs. Hartwell's composure cracked slightly. Her eyes widened as she stared at the recorder and her hands gripped her folder more tightly. Disciplinary meeting? Lawrence, I thought we were discussing a student's grade appeal. We are, but my investigation has raised some concerns about your grading practices and your treatment of certain students. I need to address those concerns formally. Lawrence pressed the record button and stated the date, time, and purpose of the meeting for the record. Then he looked directly at Mrs. Hartwell, his expression professional but serious. Rebecca, I've completed a thorough review of Miss Johnson's grade appeal, and I've determined that her essay was improperly evaluated. The grade of F will be changed to an A, effective immediately. The color drained from Mrs. Hartwell's face. Lawrence, you can't just override my professional judgment because a student complains. That sets a dangerous precedent for teacher autonomy. I'm not overriding your professional judgment, Rebecca. I'm correcting an error in evaluation that appears to have been influenced by factors other than academic merit. Lawrence's voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable authority in his tone. Miss Johnson's essay met all the stated requirements of the assignment. It was well-researched, properly cited, and demonstrated sophisticated analytical thinking. The only criticism you've been able to articulate is that her conclusions made you uncomfortable. Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward in her chair, her professional mask finally slipping completely. That girl has been nothing but trouble since the day she walked into my classroom. She questions everything. She argues with established curricula. She tries to turn every discussion into a political debate. Students like her are disruptive to the learning environment. Students like her? Lawrence repeated quietly, allowing the phrase to hang in the air between them. What exactly do you mean by that, Rebecca? The question forced Mrs. Hartwell to confront the implications of her own words. She seemed to realize that she had revealed more than she intended, and she scrambled to backtrack. I mean students who are more interested in pushing their personal agendas than in learning the material they're supposed to learn. And you believe Miss Johnson falls into that category because she wrote an essay connecting historical protest strategies to contemporary student activism? I believe Miss Johnson falls into that category because she consistently challenges authority and refuses to accept that some topics are inappropriate for classroom discussion. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was rising now, her frustration and defensiveness becoming more apparent. Lawrence made another note on his pad, then looked back at his colleague. Rebecca, I've spoken with several other teachers who have worked with Miss Johnson. They describe her as engaged, respectful, and academically gifted. They praise her ability to ask thoughtful questions and make insightful connections. Why do you think your experience has been so different? The question clearly caught Mrs. Hartwell off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently struggling to find an answer that wouldn't further incriminate her. Finally, she said, Perhaps other teachers are more tolerant of disruptive behavior than I am. Or perhaps, Lawrence suggested gently, other teachers are more comfortable with students who think independently and aren't afraid to express their ideas. He reached into his desk and pulled out copies of the informal complaints that had been filed against Mrs. Hartwell over the past 2 years. Rebecca, I want to show you something. These are documentation of concerns raised by 3 different families about their children's experiences in your classroom. Do you see any patterns here? Mrs. Hartwell glanced at the papers reluctantly, her face growing paler as she recognized the names. Those were minor issues, Lawrence. Parent complaints happen to every teacher. Yes, they do. But these complaints all share certain characteristics. They all involve students of color. They all describe feelings of being unwelcome in classroom discussions, and they all mention your tendency to dismiss certain perspectives as inappropriate or off-topic. Lawrence's tone remained professional, but his words carried unmistakable weight. I treat all my students equally, Mrs. Hartwell insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm sure you believe that, Rebecca, but the evidence suggests otherwise. And Miss Johnson's case appears to be the culmination of a pattern that we can't ignore any longer. Lawrence set the complaints aside and leaned back in his chair. Here's what's going to happen. Miss Johnson's grade will be changed to an A, as I mentioned. You will issue a written apology to her and her family, acknowledging that the original grade was inappropriate, and you will attend mandatory professional development training on cultural competency and inclusive teaching practices. Mrs. Hartwell's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, indignation, and finally resignation. And if I refuse, then we'll need to discuss whether Jefferson High School is the right place for you to continue your career. Lawrence's tone was matter-of-fact, but the implication was clear. The silence stretched between them for several long moments. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell asked, "What about Miss Johnson? Will there be any consequences for her behavior?" "Her behavior," Lawrence repeated. "You mean her willingness to think critically about historical events and their contemporary relevance? Her courage in standing up for herself when she was treated unfairly? Her commitment to following proper procedures when appealing your decision?" He shook his head. "No, Rebecca. There will be no consequences for Miss Johnson because she hasn't done anything wrong." Mrs. Hartwell gathered her folder and stood up slowly, her movements those of someone who had been defeated but not yet convinced. "This sends a terrible message, Lawrence. Students will think they can challenge any grade they don't like. Students will think they can expect fair treatment based on the quality of their work rather than their teacher's personal biases," Lawrence corrected. "That's exactly the message I want to send." After Mrs. Hartwell left his office, Lawrence sat quietly for several minutes, processing the weight of what had just occurred. He had essentially accused a veteran teacher of racial bias and forced her to acknowledge that her treatment of a student had been inappropriate. The ramifications would extend far beyond this individual case. But as he thought about Simone Johnson, about her intelligence, her integrity, her refusal to be silenced, he knew he had made the right decision. Students like her were the future of education, the reason schools existed in the first place. If he couldn't protect them, what was the point of his position? He picked up his phone to call Simone and share the news. The conversation would mark the end of one battle, but he suspected it might also be the beginning of something larger. Word of this case would spread throughout the school and the community. Other students who had been silenced might find their voices. Other teachers might reconsider their own biases and assumptions. Change, Lawrence reflected, often began with one person refusing to accept injustice. Today, that person had been a 17-year-old girl named Simone Johnson. Tomorrow, it might be someone else entirely. But the important thing was that the door had been opened, the precedent had been set, and at Jefferson High School, at least for now, critical thinking and courageous expression would be valued over compliance and silence. As he dialed Simone's number, Lawrence found himself smiling for the first time in days. Sometimes, he thought, the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. The debate team practice room had become Simone's sanctuary in the weeks following Principal Washington's decision. The familiar smell of old books and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of focused intensity that helped her channel the emotional energy from her confrontation with Mrs. Hartwell into productive preparation for the state championship. Coach Camille Davis stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, outlining the structure of the final debate rounds that would determine the state champion in just 6 weeks. Around the table sat the 5 members of Jefferson High's varsity debate team, their notebooks open, pens poised to capture every strategic insight their coach shared. The state championship operates on a different level than anything you've experienced before, Coach Davis explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had guided teams through this crucible multiple times. The research is deeper. The arguments more sophisticated, the competition more intense. Every team that makes it to state has earned their place through months of rigorous preparation. Simone sat at the head of the table, her role as team captain evident in the way the others deferred to her judgment on tactical questions. Beside her sat Aaliyah Thompson, her debate partner and closest friend on the team, whose quick wit and encyclopedic knowledge of current events made her a formidable opponent in cross-examination rounds. What's this year's topic? Asked Trevor Martinez, a junior whose passion for environmental issues had made him the team's expert on climate policy debates. Coach Davis wrote the resolution on the whiteboard. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its funding for public education infrastructure. Simone felt a familiar surge of excitement as she read the words. This was exactly the kind of complex policy issue that played to her strengths as a researcher and analytical thinker. The topic touched on economics, social justice, federal versus state authority, and long-term societal investment, all areas where she had developed deep expertise over her 4 years on the team. The beauty of this resolution, Coach Davis continued, is that it allows for multiple angles of approach. Teams can argue about funding mechanisms, infrastructure priorities, federal oversight, or the broader philosophy of public education's role in society. The key is finding an approach that's both unique and defensible. Aaliyah raised her hand. Have we seen any indication of what strategies other top teams are planning to use? From what I've heard at coaches' meetings, most teams are focusing on traditional infrastructure needs, building repairs, technology upgrades, basic facility improvements. That's the safe approach, and it'll probably be effective for teams that execute well. Coach Davis paused, studying her students' faces. But safe approaches rarely win state championships. Simone leaned forward, her competitive instincts engaging. What are you thinking, Coach? What's our angle? I'm thinking we need to redefine what infrastructure means in the context of modern education. Physical buildings and technology are important, but what about the human infrastructure? What about addressing systemic inequalities that affect how resources are distributed? What about investing in programs that support students who face barriers to educational success? The room fell silent as the team members processed the implications of this approach. It was ambitious, potentially controversial, and would require extensive research to support effectively. It was also exactly the kind of bold strategy that could either win them the championship or eliminate them in the early rounds. That's risky, Trevor said quietly. Judges might see it as changing the topic rather than addressing the resolution. Or they might see it as sophisticated thinking that goes beyond surface-level analysis, Aaliyah countered. If we can prove that systemic inequalities are infrastructure problems that require federal intervention, we could have the strongest case at the tournament. Simone had been quiet during this exchange, her mind racing through the possibilities and challenges of the approach Coach Davis had outlined. The strategy felt familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten. It was similar to the analytical approach that had gotten her in trouble with Mrs. Hartwell, connecting historical context to contemporary issues and arguing for systemic change rather than incremental reforms. Coach, she said, slowly, this approach essentially argues that educational inequality is a form of structural injustice that requires federal intervention to address. We'd be making the case that some students face barriers that individual effort and local resources can't overcome. Exactly, Coach Davis replied. And given your personal experience with how systemic biases can affect educational opportunities, you're uniquely positioned to make that argument with both intellectual rigor and emotional authenticity. The reference to her conflict with Mrs. Hartwell hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. The team had rallied around Simone during her grade appeal process, offering support and solidarity that had strengthened their bonds as competitors and friends. I'm not sure we should build our championship strategy around my personal experiences, Simone said carefully. This needs to be about the strongest possible argument, not about making a statement. It's not about making a statement, Coach Davis assured her. It's about leveraging your authentic understanding of these issues to construct the most compelling case possible. Your research abilities, your analytical skills, your communication talents, all of those come together naturally when you're arguing about topics you genuinely understand and care about. Over the next 2 hours, the team began developing their approach to the resolution. They divided research responsibilities, identified key sources and expert testimonies they would need, and outlined the basic structure of their affirmative case. The work was intense, requiring them to master complex policy details while crafting arguments that would be both logically sound and emotionally persuasive. As the other team members packed up their materials and headed home, Simone lingered in the practice room with Coach Davis. The championship was still weeks away, but she could already feel the weight of expectations and the pressure of competition building in her chest. "Coach, can I ask you something?" Simone settled back into her chair, her expression serious. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Do you think I'm making a mistake, taking on Mrs. Hartwell, pursuing this debate strategy, putting myself in positions where I have to defend controversial ideas?" Simone's voice was quiet, revealing vulnerability she rarely showed. "Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to just keep my head down and focus on getting into college." Coach Davis studied her star debater for a moment before responding. "Simone, I've been coaching debate for 8 years. I've worked with dozens of talented students, some of whom went on to attend prestigious universities and build successful careers. But I've never worked with anyone who has your combination of intellectual ability, moral courage, and competitive drive." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The easy path you're talking about, keeping your head down, avoiding controversy, saying what people want to hear, that path is available to you. Your grades are excellent, your test scores are strong, and you have the kind of background story that college admissions officers love. You could probably get into any school you want without ever taking another risk." "But," Simone prompted, sensing there was more to come. "But that wouldn't be you. The Simone Johnson I know doesn't back down from challenges or compromise her principles for convenience. The student who stood up to Mrs. Hartwell, who's been organizing for positive change at this school, who's prepared to argue for systemic reform at the state championship, that's who you really are. And that's the person who's going to make a real difference in the world." The words resonated deeply with Simone, connecting to something fundamental about how she saw herself and her role in the world. She had never been content to accept injustice or inequality simply because challenging them was difficult or risky. The thought of spending the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had been more courageous was far more frightening than the prospect of facing opposition or setbacks. "Okay," she said, straightening in her chair. "Let's win this thing. Let's build the strongest possible case for educational justice and take it all the way to the championship round." Coach Davis smiled, pride evident in her expression. "Now that's the competitor I know. That's the debater who's going to bring home the state title." As Simone gathered her materials and prepared to leave, she felt a familiar surge of determination flowing through her veins. The next 6 weeks would test everything she had learned about research, argumentation, and competitive performance. She would face opponents who were just as talented and motivated as she was, judges who would scrutinize every claim and challenge every assumption. But she would also have something that couldn't be taught or trained: the authenticity that came from arguing for principles she genuinely believed in, from using her voice to advocate for students who faced the same challenges she had experienced firsthand. The state championship would be more than a competition. It would be an opportunity to prove that thoughtful, principled arguments could prevail over safe, conventional wisdom. It would be a chance to demonstrate that students like her, students who refused to be silenced or intimidated, had valuable contributions to make to important conversations. As she walked out of the school building into the cool evening air, Simone felt the weight of the challenge ahead. But she also felt something else: excitement. She was about to embark on the most important competition of her academic career, and she couldn't wait to get started. The championship was 6 weeks away. The real preparation was just beginning. The state capitol convention center buzzed with nervous energy as debate teams from across the state converged for the championship tournament. The cavernous space had been transformed into a maze of debate rounds, with portable classrooms set up in long rows and registration tables staffed by volunteer judges and tournament officials. The air hummed with whispered strategy sessions, last-minute research reviews, and the kind of focused intensity that only came from months of preparation, culminating in a single weekend of competition. Simone stood near the Jefferson High School banner that marked their team's staging area, her navy blazer pressed and her debate materials organized in neat folders labeled by round and argument type. Around her, teammates made final adjustments to their cases, reviewed flow sheets, and engaged in the quiet rituals that helped manage pre-competition nerves. The tournament format was unforgiving: 5 preliminary rounds followed by elimination rounds that would narrow the field from 64 teams to a single state champion. Each round presented new opponents, new judges, and new challenges that would test not just their preparation, but their ability to adapt and respond to unexpected arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the State Championship Debate Tournament," announced the tournament director, her voice echoing through the convention center's sound system. "We have teams here representing the very best high school debate programs in the state. Over the next 3 days, you'll engage in rigorous intellectual competition that will challenge your research, reasoning, and communication abilities." Coach Davis gathered her team in a circle, her expression serious but confident. "This is what we've been preparing for all season. You know your arguments, you've practiced your delivery, and you've developed the tactical flexibility to handle whatever your opponents throw at you. Trust your preparation and compete with confidence." Simone felt the familiar pre-competition rush of adrenaline mixed with nervous anticipation. She had competed in dozens of tournaments over her 4 years on the team, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the competition more intense, and the personal significance more profound. Their first-round opponent was Lincoln Preparatory Academy, a private school team known for their polished presentation and extensive research resources. As Simone and Aaliyah walked into the debate classroom, they could see their opponents spreading out color-coded research files and setting up laptop computers that suggested they had access to premium databases and professional coaching. The judge for the round was Dr. Margaret Sterling, a college debate coach whose reputation for rigorous evaluation and detailed feedback made her both respected and feared among high school competitors. She sat at the front of the room, her laptop open and her evaluation sheets ready, embodying the kind of intellectual authority that would determine their tournament fate. "Good morning, debaters," Dr. Sterling said as the round began. "Today's resolution is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its funding for public education infrastructure. Lincoln Prep, you have won the coin toss and elected to argue negative. Jefferson High, you will be affirming. Preparation time begins now." For the next 8 minutes, Simone and Aaliyah huddled over their case materials, making final adjustments to their arguments based on intelligence they had gathered about Lincoln Prep's typical strategies. They had anticipated that their opponents would focus on fiscal responsibility and federal overreach arguments, and their research suggested they were correct. "First affirmative constructive, you have 6 minutes, Dr. Sterling announced. Simone stood and approached the podium, her notes in hand, but her opening lines memorized through hours of practice. "Dr. Sterling, The current public education infrastructure crisis represents a fundamental failure of educational equity that demands federal intervention. While traditional approaches to this resolution focus on buildings and technology, we argue that true infrastructure includes the systems and supports that ensure all students have access to educational opportunities. She outlined their case with practiced precision, explaining how systemic inequalities in funding, resources, and support services created barriers that prevented students from reaching their potential. The argument was complex, weaving together economic analysis, social justice concerns, and policy research to make the case that federal investment could address problems that local communities couldn't solve on their own. Lincoln Prep's negative case was exactly what they had expected: a fiscally conservative argument about federal debt, state authority, and the inefficiency of large-scale government programs. Their speakers were polished and well-prepared, but their arguments felt generic, lacking the kind of specific analysis that would distinguish them from dozens of other teams making similar cases. As the round progressed, Simone found herself in her element. The cross-examination periods allowed her to demonstrate the depth of her research and the sophistication of her analytical thinking. When Lincoln Prep's second speaker tried to argue that educational inequalities were primarily the result of individual choices rather than systemic barriers, Simone was ready with data and examples that exposed the weakness of that position. The evidence clearly shows that students in high-poverty schools face challenges that individual effort cannot overcome, she argued during her rebuttal speech. When schools lack basic resources, when students face food insecurity and housing instability, when systemic biases affect teacher expectations and disciplinary policies, the solution requires structural change, not just individual responsibility. The round concluded with both teams feeling cautiously optimistic about their performance, but tournament rules prevented judges from announcing decisions until all preliminary rounds were complete. As they packed up their materials and prepared for their second round, Coach Davis approached with initial feedback. "Strong start," she said quietly. "Your arguments were clear, your evidence was solid, and you handled their cross-examination well. Lincoln Prep is good, but I think you may have had the edge in analysis and impact." Round 2 brought a new challenge. Riverside Community High, a public school team from a rural district that had built their case around agricultural education and vocational training programs. Their approach was creative and well-researched, arguing that infrastructure investment should prioritize practical skills that would prepare students for immediate employment in their local communities. This opponent required a different tactical approach. Rather than defending against fiscal conservatism, Simone and Aliyah had to argue for the importance of broad educational access while respecting the legitimate concerns of communities that felt disconnected from traditional academic pathways. Educational infrastructure must serve all students, Simone argued in her constructive speech, including those who will pursue vocational careers and those who will continue to higher education, but separating students into different tracks based on assumptions about their potential or their community's needs perpetuates the very inequalities we seek to address. The round was more difficult than their opener, requiring them to balance respect for their opponent's perspective with a clear articulation of why their approach was superior. By the end of cross-examination, both teams had landed significant arguments, and the judge scribbled furiously on her flowsheet, her poker face betraying nothing. As the day went on, Simone and Aliyah advanced through round after round, sharpening their strategy with each new opponent. They faced teams with economic arguments focused on federal deficits, others who argued for charter schools as a better solution than public infrastructure, and still others who insisted the resolution was too broad to be implemented realistically. Each challenge forced them to adapt, to dig deeper into their research, to think faster on their feet. By the end of the preliminary rounds, Jefferson High was undefeated, one of only 3 teams to achieve that distinction out of the 64 in attendance. When the tournament director posted the rankings on the giant bracket board in the convention center lobby, Simone felt a wave of pride rush through her. Jefferson High was seeded 3rd overall, earning them a direct path into the elimination rounds. That night, the team gathered at the hotel where they were staying, sprawled across the carpet of Coach Davis's room as they reviewed arguments and prepped new evidence blocks. The atmosphere was equal parts exhaustion and exhilaration, fueled by pizza boxes and the hum of late-night determination. Simone's mind was tired, but her spirit burned with a fire she hadn't felt since the day Mrs. Hartwell had failed her. Here, in the crucible of competition, her voice was not just allowed but celebrated. Here, her critical thinking was not a threat, but a weapon. Here, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next morning would bring the elimination rounds, and with them, the true test of everything she had fought for. The quarterfinal round had barely ended when Simone felt the full weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her shoulders. Jefferson High had won convincingly, their arguments polished, their delivery sharp, and their evidence airtight. But now, as the tournament director announced the semi-final matchups over the loudspeaker, a ripple of whispers spread through the convention center. Jefferson High had drawn the toughest possible opponent, Westbrook Academy, the reigning 3-time state champions. For years, Westbrook had been the team to beat. Their debaters, Chloe Miller and Nathan Green, were legendary in the circuit. Chloe, a senior with a reputation for speaking at nearly 400 words per minute without faltering, was known as the Machine. Nathan, a tall, serious-eyed junior, had an uncanny ability to dismantle opponents' cases point by point until there was nothing left but silence. Together they were formidable, polished, confident, and backed by resources that dwarfed those of Jefferson High. Private tutors, subscriptions to expensive policy databases, and a coaching staff that included 2 former college champions gave Westbrook an almost unfair advantage. When Simone and Aaliyah walked into the semi-final room, the atmosphere was electric. 3 judges sat at the front, a retired national champion, a professor of political science from the state university, and a veteran high school coach who had seen it all. Spectators crowded in, spilling into the hallway, eager to watch David face Goliath. Simone felt her stomach twist, but she drew a slow breath and reminded herself of the battles she'd already fought, battles that had prepared her for this moment. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its funding for public education infrastructure. The resolution remained the same, but here, in the crucible of the semifinal, the words carried a heavier weight. Simone stood for the first affirmative constructive. Her blazer was perfectly pressed, but more than that, her posture radiated calm determination. She spoke clearly, deliberately, resisting the urge to match Chloe's expected breakneck pace. Instead, she framed the debate around justice as infrastructure. Our opponents will tell you that infrastructure is bricks and mortar, walls and wires, Simone began, her voice steady. We agree that buildings matter, but education infrastructure is more than concrete. It is equity. It is the system that either lifts students up or leaves them behind. And when entire communities are trapped in cycles of underfunded schools, that failure of infrastructure demands federal intervention. Her case was methodical but passionate, weaving statistics about crumbling schools with human stories of children learning in overcrowded classrooms. She cited studies from the Department of Education, expert testimony from economists, and personal accounts that illustrated how inequality perpetuated itself when left unaddressed. By the time she sat down, the room was silent. Then Westbrook struck. Chloe launched into her speech like a whirlwind, words spilling so quickly that some spectators struggled to keep up. She cited Congressional Budget Office reports, historical examples of federal inefficiency, and dozens of numbers pulled from obscure studies. Her delivery was clinical, mechanical, and relentless. Nathan followed up in cross-examination, pouncing on any perceived weakness. "Isn't it true," he pressed, "that federal programs historically create more bureaucracy than solutions? Can you name one federal education program that hasn't wasted billions of dollars in overhead?" Simone didn't flinch. "Head Start," she replied, citing long-term studies that proved its effectiveness in preparing disadvantaged students for school. Nathan pressed again, shifting angles, but Simone parried calmly, always returning to her central theme. Equity wasn't optional, it was infrastructure itself. As the round wore on, the clash became intense. Chloe and Nathan fired off fiscal conservative arguments, painting federal investment as reckless spending. Aaliyah countered with evidence that inequitable funding at the state and local levels created systemic gaps that only federal action could fix. Every claim met a counterclaim. Every rebuttal demanded precision. Sweat beaded at Simone's temples, but her voice never wavered. The turning point came in Simone's rebuttal. She slowed her cadence, forcing the judges to focus on her words. "If this debate is about dollars and deficits, then maybe Westbrook wins," she said, her voice resonating. "But this debate is about children, about the students who sit in classrooms with leaking ceilings, about the students using 20-year-old textbooks, about the students who deserve the same future as anyone else. Infrastructure isn't just about walls, it's about justice. And when justice crumbles, every brick in every building fails." A murmur rippled through the audience. Even some of Westbrook's supporters leaned forward, listening intently. The contrast was stark. Chloe's rapid-fire delivery left listeners dizzy, while Simone's deliberate framing painted a picture no one could ignore. The round ended, and the teams packed up in silence, waiting for the decision. Outside in the convention center hallway, teammates, coaches, and parents gathered, buzzing with speculation. The judges deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Simone sat with Aaliyah, their hands clasped tightly, hearts pounding. Finally, the judges returned. The head judge, the retired champion, stepped forward. "By a 2-1 decision," he announced, "the winner of this semi-final round, advancing to the state championship final, Jefferson High School." The Jefferson team erupted in cheers. Simone felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged Aaliyah. They had done the impossible, defeated the reigning champions. The underdogs had prevailed. For the first time all season, Westbrook was out and Jefferson High was going to the finals. The main auditorium had been transformed into a battlefield of ideas. Rows of chairs filled with students, coaches, and proud parents stretched back toward the double doors. A massive banner hung overhead, 2025 State Debate Championship Final Round. At the front, 2 tables faced each other beneath bright stage lights. On the left sat Jefferson High. On the right, Oak Ridge Collegiate. Oak Ridge's reputation preceded them. Unlike Westbrook's policy-heavy style, Oak Ridge specialized in philosophical frameworks, often shifting debates into the realm of morality and ethics. Their debaters, twins Rachel and Daniel Harper, were notorious for reframing policy resolutions into moral dilemmas that left opponents scrambling. They didn't just argue numbers, they argued about the meaning of justice itself. The 3-judge panel looked serious and attentive. A law professor, a high school superintendent, and a former debate national finalist. The stakes had never been higher. Simone rose for the first affirmative constructive, her voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. She opened with a story, not statistics, not policy jargon, but a vivid picture of a student in a decaying school. She described a classroom where buckets caught rain from a leaking ceiling, where textbooks still referred to the Soviet Union in the present tense, where students shared outdated computers that crashed mid-assignment. Then she connected that image to the resolution. This is infrastructure, and when infrastructure fails, education fails. The United States federal government has both the resources and the responsibility to fix it. She moved seamlessly into evidence, citing government reports, studies, and economic analyses that proved how federal investment could level the playing field. But she always came back to her theme: equity as infrastructure, justice as necessity. Oak Ridge countered with their signature move. Rachel launched into a sweeping philosophical framework, arguing that local autonomy was the moral cornerstone of education. Communities have the right to self-govern, she declared. Federal intervention is not just inefficient, it is immoral. It strips citizens of agency, replacing local responsibility with faceless bureaucracy. True justice means respecting the autonomy of communities to decide how they educate their children. Daniel followed, reinforcing the moral argument with rhetorical flourish. He quoted philosophers, invoked the principles of democracy, and painted federal intervention as paternalistic control. The audience murmured their arguments were elegant, almost poetic. But then came cross-examination. Simone leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. You argue that local autonomy is justice, but if a community lacks the resources to provide safe schools, is it justice to let children sit in broken classrooms? If autonomy means preserving inequality, are you defending justice or neglect? The room went quiet. Even the judges leaned in. Rachel hesitated for the first time all round, fumbling for a response. Daniel jumped in, but Simone pressed harder, armed with data showing how local funding disparities tracked directly with racial and economic inequities. Autonomy, she argued, was meaningless without equity. The debate raged on. Oak Ridge painted federal action as an overreach of power. Jefferson reframed it as the fulfillment of a moral duty. Aaliyah's rebuttal was razor-sharp, hammering home the idea that equity was not a luxury but a foundation. Rachel and Daniel closed with soaring rhetoric about freedom and democracy, and then it was Simone's turn for the final affirmative. She didn't speak like a debater now. She spoke like someone who had lived the stakes. Her voice trembled with passion but never faltered. This isn't abstract. This isn't theoretical. I've seen what underfunded schools look like. I've seen what inequity feels like. And I stand here today to say, infrastructure is not only walls and wires. It is opportunity. It is justice. And the federal government cannot sit idly by while that infrastructure crumbles. The audience erupted in applause, quickly hushed by the judges. The round ended. Both teams sat exhausted as the judges left to deliberate. The wait was torture. Simone's hand shook as she clutched her notes. She thought of her parents, of Principal Washington, of Coach Davis. She thought of Mrs. Hartwell and the red F that had once threatened to silence her. And she thought of every student who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. The judges returned. The superintendent, acting as panel chair, stepped forward with the ballot. The entire auditorium held its breath. By unanimous decision, she announced, the winner of the 2025 State Debate Championship is Jefferson High School. The room exploded. Cheers, applause, shouts of joy. Simone and Aaliyah embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Coach Davis lifted the trophy high, her pride shining as brightly as the silver cup itself. For Jefferson High, it was more than a victory. It was history. The underdogs had triumphed. Justice had prevailed. The championship victory sent ripples far beyond the walls of the convention center. By the next morning, the local newspaper carried a front-page photo of Simone and Aaliyah holding the trophy aloft, their smiles radiant, their navy blazers crisp under the headline, Jefferson High Tops, State Students Defy Odds to Win Title. At Jefferson High, the news spread like wildfire. Students who had never cared about debate were suddenly asking questions, congratulating Simone in the hallways, and taking selfies with the championship medal. Teachers paused lessons to acknowledge the victory, and the morning announcements dedicated a special segment to celebrating the team. For the first time, Jefferson High wasn't just another public school struggling with budget cuts. It was the home of state champions. But for Simone, the aftermath was about more than accolades. It was vindication. The F that had once threatened to derail her senior year now felt like a distant shadow, overshadowed by the gleaming A on her transcript and the championship medal that hung around her neck. Colleges that had already shown interest now flooded her inbox with scholarship offers and invitations to apply. Recruiters from Ivy League schools reached out, and letters poured in from across the state, praising her courage and intellect. At home, the Johnson household glowed with pride. Denise cried when she saw the newspaper spread, clutching it to her chest as though it were proof that all the double shifts, all the sacrifices, had been worth it. Calvin framed a copy and hung it above the kitchen table, his eyes misting every time he looked at it. "That's my baby girl," he said to anyone who would listen. "That's my daughter who beat the system and won." At school, Principal Washington held an assembly in the gymnasium. Standing before hundreds of students, he addressed the significance of the win. "This victory is about more than debate," he said, his voice echoing. "It's about courage. It's about students who refuse to be silenced. It's about proving that critical thinking, persistence, and integrity matter more than compliance. Jefferson High will always be a place where student voices are valued, respected, and heard." The applause thundered, but Simone's thoughts wandered to the teacher who wasn't clapping. Mrs. Hartwell sat in the back row, her face unreadable. She had returned to the classroom after completing mandatory cultural competency training, but her influence had diminished. Students who once feared her now saw her differently, aware that her authority had limits. She no longer wielded silence as a weapon. The story of Simone's F had spread, and with it, the knowledge that injustice could be challenged and overturned. Simone, for her part, didn't dwell on Hartwell anymore. The Scarlet F had been transformed into a badge of resilience, the spark that ignited her fight. Without it, she might never have found the fire that carried her to the championship. Sometimes, she realized, the obstacles meant to silence you become the very fuel that makes you unstoppable. The banquet that followed the championship was a blur of speeches, applause, and photographs. Simone stood before the crowd, the medal around her neck, the trophy gleaming beside her. She spoke not as a student seeking validation, but as a young woman who had claimed her voice. "This championship isn't just about winning debates," she said, her voice strong. "It's about proving that students have the right to speak, to question, to think critically. It's about showing that silence is never the answer when justice is at stake. Tonight we celebrate a trophy, but tomorrow we continue the fight in classrooms, in communities, wherever voices need to be heard." The room erupted in applause, and Simone felt a swell of emotion that nearly overwhelmed her. She thought of her younger brother in the front row, watching her with wide eyes, knowing now that he too could stand tall and be heard. She thought of the generations before her who had marched, protested, and written words that risked everything. And she thought of the generations after her who might find courage in her story. Later that night, lying in bed with the medal still around her neck, Simone stared at the ceiling, replaying the journey that had brought her here. The confrontation in room 204, the red F, the decision to fight instead of fold, the semifinal victory over Westbrook, the final round triumph over Oak Ridge. It was a journey marked by struggle, but also by strength. She knew the battles weren't over. Life would bring more challenges, more people who tried to silence voices like hers. But she also knew she was ready, because she had learned the most important lesson. Silence was complicity, and Simone Johnson would never be silent again.